So today, it's kind of a transition day, or maybe kind of one of those days where in between presentations, that will kind of go back into kind of following up on some of the earlier presentations regarding number 4 here, my personal academic journey. Just kind of showing how I have incorporated some of these different theories into my studies. And the reading posted for today, an optional reading as well, but that is an evaluative essay. Actually, why don't I just keep moving forward with this, because I think I talk about that later. Right, this is kind of with the mentality. I've realized this is a kind of a class based on my own experiences with similar classes, is that we study a variety of different approaches, different theories, and so forth. But in my experience, I'm not going to claim that I have, equally paid as much attention to every theory that I looked at. So classes that I've taken, I've had to say, oh, among the various theorists that we've studied, who is particularly interesting, relevant to me? So that's been my experience, and something that I would convey for students to think about as well is who in particular. And there's some things that have already led in that direction in this class already. Students would choose a particular theorist to answer a midterm exam question on. Students would choose a particular theorist to do their presentations on. So there is already some of that aspect of choosing particular theorists. And so just kind of want to keep encouraging that. Maybe you chose a particular theorist to do a presentation on, but maybe you didn't think as much about like what kind of drew me to that theorist. So just kind of encouraging that kind of mentality in this class. My own personal academic journey has been influenced through engagement with different disciplines. The academic discipline of religious studies was also a topic of study in my master's thesis. So these are a few ways that I bring in some of my own experience, my personal academic journey. As I mentioned, my master's thesis on religious studies at Catholic Benedictine universities. So you can see there's definitely a personal aspect to that. I wasn't just studying religious studies at Benedictine universities as some kind of interesting abstract concept. It's like, oh, obviously that is relevant to me. I am a Benedictine at a Benedictine Catholic university, and like exploring the topic of religious studies was obviously going to be very relevant on a personal level. Eventually, when I went to study at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, why did I become a scholar of religion rather than a theologian? What led me into the area of Christian spirituality? As I mentioned, one is that when I was applying to Graduate Theological Union, I mentioned to the Abbot 3 areas that I thought could be areas for me to study in, right? We have to choose a particular area. And, religious studies wasn't really one of the options, although some of these areas are somewhat related to religious studies. I think GTU also had an area that was called cultural and historical studies of religion. That was kind of like an equivalent to religious studies. Anyway, Abbott and Father Killian suggested that I would go into Christian spirituality. And that took some adaptation to really understand what is Christian spirituality. One of the big things for me that I had to really shift is that my master's thesis was in theological studies. And so theology is mainly a lot of the study of ideas, doctrines, and so forth. Theology is heavily, very, very heavily, traditionally over centuries associated with philosophy. And Christian spirituality places a lot of emphasis, and Christian spirituality distinguishes itself as distinct from theology in the sense of Christian spirituality's focus on experience. So I actually had to really kind of think more about what does that mean to focus more on experience, the practices, the actual life, behaviors, in contrast to the ideas and so forth. Yeah, so this is the essay that I posted as an optional reading for today. That is an evaluative essay that I wrote for a class with Dr. Steve Davidson, biblical scholar. I think this class that I took, Hermeneutics from On the Edge, that is how the class title was actually, the on is in the middle of the word from. That's how they, I think I have that correctly as far as the way they presented it. But that class was, I think, similar to this class in a sense that it was really looking at a variety of different approaches, hermeneutics. And hermeneutics is a term that has come up in a few different ways in this class, particularly with Schleiermacher and hermeneutics, how to interpret the Bible, for example, is one of the areas. So here are a few things that I put in that evaluative essay. And here I'm also going to present a two-part. This is particularly a part where I'm presenting on phenomenology. How I wrote about phenomenology in 2011. That's basically now 12 years ago. And what I was kind of thinking about at that time, and then different from where I'm at now. But I start out by saying, as scholars, without examining, analyzing, and developing our methodological hermeneutic approach, we risk being blind to the biases with which we present the fruits of our research. So here, I think when I look back on what I'm saying here, I noticed that I put here, we risk being blind to the biases. What I'm saying here, I'm not exactly saying that we risk being biased, because in a way, that is inevitable. We will have certain biases, and that is some of the limitations of phenomenology. Phenomenology was an attempt to be unbiased, but ultimately realizing that isn't really possible. So here I'm saying, well, the risk isn't so much being biased, but the risk is being blind to, right? So I think that's what I would also convey, is that this class is to really look at theories, think about our own approaches, and becoming aware of whatever our biases are. And sometimes it may be helpful to say, hey, I'm being biased here. I'm gonna kind of look at something from a Catholic perspective. It will have a certain bias to it, but better to just let you know that I'll come from that particular bias rather than just to kind of try to falsely present that I don't have a particular bias. Okay. So this is basically what I'm saying is that attention to these questions is essential to the scholar and worthy for continual evaluation and development. So one of the things, as I mentioned, we were looking at phenomenology earlier in the semester a few different times. And what led me to consider myself to be a phenomenologist of religion. Eventually, I started to realize, you know, I've been using phenomenology enough that I would basically consider myself a phenomenologist. It was fall of 2001. I was interested in kind of look back specifically at, I took contemporary philosophy with Father George, a monk here, who you may see walking down the halls or something, or may have had a class with him. Teaches philosophy, has taught here, taught philosophy here for a certain amount of time. And I took, in that class, he taught about Husserl, a phenomenologist. And that was kind of an introduction to phenomenology for me. Yep, 2011, when I wrote this essay, I basically state that a key issue that has been important to me is that is the subjectivity-objectivity problem, particularly prevalent in phenomenological discourse. And some of what I say about you know, the subjectivity-objectivity problem is related to teaching at a Catholic Benedictine university. So theology is much more of the standard at Catholic universities for centuries. Religious studies and phenomenology is kind of a newer thing. So it's kind of like, even if it's been around for some time, there's still a question of, does this really fit in? And this class itself, Modern Theories of Religion, has been introduced into the curriculum only within the last 10 years or so. So this class is somewhat new, and it's kind of like, how does this really fit in with a Catholic Benedictine university? Theology obviously fits in and has always fit in with Catholic universities since universities began, but the religious studies aspect, the phenomenological aspect. So that was something that I definitely thought about, especially when I was teaching introduction to religious studies for the first few times. It's like, okay, well, this is what religious studies is, like what we've been kind of covering over the course of this semester. It's like, but some of these theorists are very, very critical of Christianity and Catholicism. So it's like, a question of how to go about that. And right, so recognizing limitations of phenomenology, that I realized it was not applicable to all contexts. And so for me, you know, again, I write at the time that I'm not sure if phenomenology is redeemable. As you know, it's like, okay, phenomenology has limitations. Sometimes you hear criticisms, and these were not necessarily criticisms from a Catholic perspective, just other scholars were mentioning, you know, phenomenology claims to try to attempt to be objective, but objectivity is not really possible. So in my mind, I thought, oh, okay, well, you know, does that kind of completely ruin this kind of approach? All right, a little pause, just want to make sure I'm giving some opportunities for some. I have another question here. Now, this is a little bit more specific. What direction advice would you offer to someone who is interested in phenomenology, but is concerned about the limitations of phenomenology? Yep, so, oh, okay, Emma. So kind of one answer is that I came to realize, and even now when I think of myself as a phenomenologist, doesn't mean that I'm only a phenomenologist, that it's like, okay, that I'm a phenomenologist all the time. It's like, okay, I'm a phenomenologist, but I realize that phenomenology is only applicable, and I mean, I can promote phenomenology and things like that, but also um, let people know, phenomenology might not be appropriate in every situation. So sometimes, not too often, but a parish will invite me over to usually talk about why did I become a monk. So, there's definitely situations where I will present on certain topics, and it's like, okay, if I'm presenting to a class of Catholic students, maybe studying for their confirmation or something like that, not really an appropriate context to talk about phenomenology. So just kind of realizing that is like, okay, I can be a phenomenologist, I can use phenomenology, but doesn't mean that that is the only method that I will take. So that's one possible answer. Another possible approach is comparative theology. There is a Jesuit priest, Francis Clooney, who lived in India for quite a while, and heavily studied Hinduism. And comparative theology is kind of a newer, more recent approach, which is similar to comparative religion, but comparative religion is kind of like an ancestor to religious studies. Comparative theology incorporates that, but also is a theological perspective that would say it's great to learn about other religions, but also to kind of see how learning about other religions can benefit your own practice and faith within your own religion. So there is another possibility once I encountered comparative theology to say, okay, there are the distinctions between religious studies and theology are not as strict as always presented. Okay, here's another possible question. Yep, so we came across Ninian Smart in chapter 18 of Strensky, actually his conclusion. So in some ways it was kind of a prominent place that he kind of went through all of these theorists over the course of his book, and then chose to kind of, chose to conclude with Ninian Smart. So that's pretty interesting. Yep, you can see that right at the end of that part in Strensky. Ninian Smart, one of the most prominent, right? He wrote The Dimensions of the Sacred. The 7 different dimensions of the sacred as well. And so I think of Ninian Smart as like the most useful of the phenomenologists. Like Husserl and others, they kind of speculate, phenomenology, ideally, here's a method for phenomenology and things like that. Whereas Ninian Smart, the idea of 7 dimensions, very particularly useful, particularly for teaching religious studies. So for example, here's a comparison of different religious studies textbooks. The second column is Ninian Smart 7 Dimensions. And a lot of textbooks, give or take, generally kind of follow some variation of the 7 dimensions, maybe not exactly, but I did see some similarities that a lot of religious textbooks are kind of somewhat based on the 7 dimensions. So I think Ninian Smart helped to kind of draw me back into phenomenology, and in some ways to say the objectivity is maybe not quite as prominent of an issue with Ninian Smart. Okay. Now here's another question. Yep, in 2011, I had not encountered even Strensky's chapter on postmodernism we read earlier this semester. So I had not really even heard of Ivan Strensky, or I hadn't really used his book until I started teaching this class a couple years ago. So I could pose this question: what does postmodernism have to offer on the limitations, redeemability of phenomenology? I think of one thing, I didn't really realize this as much about postmodernism. Postmodernism, some of that we were talking about and reading about, study of religion by engaged commitment. We're like, okay, phenomenology is kind of now considered part of more antiquated, modern approaches, and then we're looking at how postmodernism kind of brings in newer, different perspectives. And one of those perspectives is the contrast between the modern approach and the mentality that the scholar was supposed to be objective, and then the postmodern mentality of, well, no, scholars can also be engaged in their practice, and that helps to benefit as well. And so leave it again with any other thoughts, comments.